Game loaded.
Hi, and welcome to an edition of Lessons Learned with your host, Rafael Pinheiro. Welcome back again to another episode of the Mathsquad podcast. Today we have Auwrath, also known as Dave, as one of the moderators of the Mathsquad Community. We have Sam M, and of course we have Cardium. Guys, say hi to the audience.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, audience.
We're going to be talking a bit about things behind the scenes of the Mathsquad from Dave, who is one of the moderators. And we're also going to be talking about game design and hacking. Adam does a lot of hacking of different games that he's talking about, being a game designer. And we're going to give it our go as well. We're going to be talking about some of the aspects of changing and adapting a game to your use. So let's start with the sort of behind the scenes, if there's anything, of the Mathsquad community. Dave, first of all, how did you become a mod in the community? How did that happen? How did relationships get established?
Oh, it's actually not a particularly interesting story, but that's totally fine. It was just back during the Fallout days, like the first game Adam streamed. He ended up getting like decent-ish numbers because he was obviously part of roleplay. He'd like spoken to JP about when they played Dungeon World. He'd been in the chat there. So he got a little bit of carryover, and that's how I heard of him as well. And honestly, I think he just picked a couple of us. I think myself and Lucas were in this first like little batch of people, of just people who had been active and helpful in chat, answering questions and like being around and not being jerks. And that's all it was. And then I had the mod thing and it stayed. We've got much more of a like friendly relationship now that like the community's a bit bigger and there's been stuff that I can do for him. But at first it was just kind of random and then it grew.
Now, Adam has said, and other people are sort of copying this sort of the alignment-based channel concept, which I really like, and hopefully when I can also do that as well. We here in the podcast and in my channel, we sort of share the same idea, neutral good or chaotic good, as he puts it in his channel. As a mod, how do you keep that going? I mean, how do you tackle that?
Well, thankfully, the group of people that we've gotten together, like the community at large, seems to be very happy in following it themselves. So I think I'd start off by saying that I don't have to do a whole lot, which I'm very thankful for, and I think is very almost unexpected, rare on the internet to find a group of people that willing to, be respectful to each other, be reasonable human beings. So good job, everyone in community.
So you basically, you foster the spirit and the spirit carries over and everybody sort of got into the same vibes. That seems to be the way it's going, right?
Yes. There was... I've spoken to Adam about this a little bit before, and it was very important during the formative times, and I guess even before he knew me, he said it was very important to find and have people who were exemplifying the things and the types of behavior that he wanted to see in the community. I think that was one of the kind of initial reasons I got made a moderator, just because I could lead by example then, sort of thing. And I think that's only grown, I guess, and expanded as part of the relationship that we have once he's got to know that, yeah, I'm like that all the time. And we agree on a lot of kind of the ways that we want to see the world, and we want to interact with people, and we want people to interact with each other. So it tends to be just sort of trying to stay true to that, and it's not too far away from the way I would deal with it personally. So we were very lucky to match up quite closely on that.
And of course, now you moved into front of the camera, so to speak, from behind the scenes. You're part of the crew that Roll20 Mage crew. How's that been as an experience?
It's been a really good experience, actually. At first, I was incredibly nervous about it. I'm quite a shy person, and the idea of being on camera really freaked me out, but slowly managed to work my way up to it, and I have a lot of fun. I actually quite like it now, and I've started doing very sporadically my own sort of streaming as well. It's been a really good confidence boost, actually, to get out there in front of people.
Talking about Mage, which is a former, now Onyx, but former White Wolf system, it's one of those dice pool systems that has a great meta, a great fiction with it. And it's one of the things that a lot of people like about White Wolf back in 1990s and even today. But because it's a dice pool system, a lot of people find it very difficult to play with, which means that the first thing that a GM does once they feel comfortable with the system is, well, hack it. Now, we're going to be talking about hacks here today, and we're going to be talking about our own experiences trying to hack something and the reasons why we would like to hack something. First of all, what is a hack? A hack is basically a step beyond simply putting a house rule, right? You're trying to fix a game so that it plays better to your style. And let's start with Caridium. Have you guys hacked any system recently, or any time you try to hack it, and why?
So I'm kind of on the far end of this scale now, in that I've graduated from being annoyed at the games I'm playing to hacking something so much that I'm basically in the later stages of making my own game now. So I basically just got so frustrated with all the different little things of all the things I was playing that I was just like, let's just start from the beginning and make something myself. So yeah, I've hacked extensively Stars Without Number, and especially D&D, and now I've done something that is like some unholy mix of Burning Wheel and Apocalypse World and all these other random things I learned from Stars Without Number and such. That's in its later stages now.
And Sam?
So I've had some experience hacking. I mean, I tend to throw in a homebrew rule or two, no matter what game I'm running, and then slowly just sort of pile on with those until it starts to become a little bit something different. I mean, I tend to, at the beginning, try to make sure that I'm sort of making like additive changes, where it's like giving my players more options as opposed to trying to hack away things. However, I think you sort of always run into this point, sort of like Scardium was saying, where you just find that thing that you just keep running into, that the game is just not working, and it's just not working no matter what you try to do. And so you just have to take out that toolkit and just start making changes. I think my first real experience was when I was trying to run a West Marches style D&D campaign. Yes. And it was just not doing what I wanted it to do. So I started making changes.
Somebody has a very chirpy bird around. Dave,
yeah, I'll close those.
No problem. Dave, there's Yugi from the Discord has asked you, how is your Blaze in the Dark hack coming along? Supposedly to be animated or anime influence? Is that a thing?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's the thing that is in the very early stages of existing. Yeah, that's the design project I set for myself that I decided to tell other people about. Just as a way of keeping myself on track to actually do stuff and be beholden to other people. I find it quite difficult to do those like personal projects and keep them going, if you see what I mean. So that started off very strongly, and I've had to slow down a little bit because of university work, but
why anime though? I mean, what is it about anime that you're like, yeah, I like to introduce anime flavor to Blaze in the Dark?
Sure. Well, what I was thinking about when I was originally going to start this, and I think it was around the same time I first heard of Blades, but hadn't finished reading it, was there's a particular like genre within anime, the sort of shonen battle genre, which is kind of translated to being one which targets a demographic of like young adult teenage males, and typically personified by like fighting and action. And I was very intrigued by the idea of trying to create systems which would let you accurately both portray and also encourage more like cinematic style combat. So I guess there's just as much influence from the anime stuff as there is from like action movies over here in the West, or like video games, any spectacle fighters, that sort of thing. And it just ended up falling a bit further on the anime style once I'd read through Blades, and there was closer to the idea of having groups set out in a specific way, thinking about skills and having a holistic kind of setting around stuff. I think the anime fit probably the best, and was most closely analogous to Blades, which I was trying to emulate at the time. It's since moved quite far away from being Blades, and it's actually kind of just a standalone game now. But yeah, that's where that came from, and that is a brief outline of what it is, I guess, or at least.
What I think is interesting about sort of that shonen genre in games is I've seen a fair number of games that have like sort of claimed to be able to do that, but not that many games that do it that well. And I think, Dave, we actually might have played a game together, I think a while back. Maybe you weren't in that game, but it was on Eric Vulgaris' show, the game called Souls of Steel, which is supposed to be sort of this pilot style game. And we tried to do it with anime mechs. And I don't know if it was just because the game was still in development or what, but it just didn't really click with our group that well, for whatever reason. And so it's always interested me because I haven't, for all the popularity, the number of times I've heard people wanting to try that sort of type of game, I haven't seen all that many systems that do it really well.
Yeah, definitely. And that was something we were both on. Yeah, that's well remembered. I had the same experience, actually. I played quite a few systems trying to get that feeling. And like for a lot of design projects, it arose from that. There is something I want games to be able to do. Unfortunately, I've not been able to find one that does it yet. So since I've got a clear goal of what I want, maybe I should be the one to try and do it. I don't know how successful it's going to be, but yeah, I played a couple of games. Like I tried Anima Prime for a while. I tried Big Eyes Small Mouth, which was like a D20 based system.
Yeah, I remember that one. The, triangular thing. I think it's something like that. It's called the system. Yeah.
Yeah. And a couple of others. There was Souls of Steel as well. But nothing quite scratched that itch. Souls of Steel was pretty close. I think Apocalypse Engine stuff can definitely allow for it, but doesn't typically promote it in the way that I would very much like.
Yeah.
There's cinematic action in that you can be as descriptive as you like within the very loose framework of the rules and like what the roles are going to ascribe, and then you can describe action on top of them, which is really nice. But they don't do anything for setting your imagination going or like giving you mechanics to underpin doing cool stuff apart from like rolling above a 10.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was definitely something that I was going to say as well, is that Souls of Steel, it felt like you can do anime with this, but it's just going to put a lot of pressure on the players and the GM to make that happen, as opposed to a game that's going to sort of make it happen through the mechanics themselves.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess we're talking about mechanics that encourage a certain style of play, which is something I think Adam and Steven have been talking about in the hack attacks, right? That part of the reason you tend to hack a system is because a system doesn't have the proper mechanics to encourage the players to think and act in the way that, in the spirit of the game.
Yeah. There's a philosophy it's mostly used to applied to video games, but I think you can apply it pretty well to RPGs as well. It's called procedural rhetoric, which is basically the idea of, like, in any game, the mechanics are going to tell a certain, the mechanics are going to elicit a certain type of story. I think that's really important to think about when you're sort of hacking and designing a game, is that you sort of you don't want to make it so that you can play a game a certain way. You want it so that, I think, the game plays itself in that way, if that makes sense. That's maybe more my opinion than like a direct, something that you can say definitively, but that's sort of the type of games that I like to play.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Oh, sorry.
It's definitely a hallmark of anything that seems to run smoothly regardless of who's playing it. Like, games that don't do that can still do well a lot of the time, but the only things that seem to be universally well received, or like everyone gets a similar level of experience from it, are ones that really go into things with that in mind. Like, D&D doesn't really do this at all, or at least not very well. And so, like, what D&D games consist of is a massive, massive spectrum. But when you get something like Portal, like, it is extremely honed in on a very specific type of humor, a very specific way of thinking about the environment you're in. And, like, everyone seems to get the same sort of positive experience out of that game.
Yeah, I think my example would be Savage Worlds. Like, Savage Worlds is supposed to be one of these very generic, you can do anything with the system type system. I know. But the problem is that, at least for me, is that Savage Worlds seems to be built almost specifically for very pulp action. And a lot of the supplements, a lot of basically hacks for Savage Worlds, official and otherwise, the ones that really work are the ones that really take the rules and really work them into very specific, very narrow adaptations of what they want. I think one of them was Necessary Evil. But if you look at that rule set is for Savage Worlds to do superheroes. If you compare it to the sort of superhero official supplement, the supplement is very generic, doesn't have a lot of the spirit of it, but Necessary Evil really hones down on the atmosphere, on the rules, and has its own rules that really generate this very specific atmosphere and feeling. By the way, people who don't know what the Necessary Evil setting is, essentially you play supervillains in a world where all the superheroes have been defeated by an alien invasion. It's a very interesting premise, and the game does it very well. But when it doesn't, when somebody does, I don't know, Star Wars, or I saw one which was XCOM, stuff like that, it just didn't bend the rules enough or to sort of feel like it's what I wanted. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I tried to do the fast system, the fast action system, because I wanted a game that would simulate Mass Effect. It didn't work out because it wasn't well balanced, but that got me started on sort of game design. And that's something I think happens to all GMs eventually, because the thing about role-playing games is that within the concept of role-playing games is the concept that one of the players will be a sort of a junior designer, whether it's adapting modules, creating their own adventures, and eventually making house rules. So eventually I think everybody, if you play long enough as a GM, will end up being a hacker of sorts. That's sort of part of the culture and the way role-playing games are made. Another experience has been that one of the things I do like, because I'm very mechanically oriented, I really like the advantage, disadvantage mechanic in 5th edition. And I would love to use it everywhere because I hate keeping track of pluses and minuses. Of course, it doesn't work everywhere, but I would love to see it in more places. So one of the things I was doing, I got an itch to do a cyberpunk thing. And I thought, I can go and use Cyberpunk 2020 or Fusion. And since I use a D10 plus that plus modifiers, I could put the advantage system right there. But then I look at some of the other rules. I said, basically, you don't have a defense stat. Instead, you have it's a post roll thing. Like you have to make an attack roll and somebody makes an opposed roll. And I said, that's one too many dice rolls. It defeats the purpose of simplifying the mechanics in one area because then you have more dice rolls in the other. Has anybody encountered a point where they're like, this is a cool mechanic I'm going to graft here, but then it goes, but now I have to have 3 or 4 more mechanics over there to sort of fit it together. Makes things more complex than they should be.
That is basically why my West Marches game in D&D 5e ended. Because I kept running into that where it basically felt like my boat was full of holes, and every time I would patch one of the holes, another one would spring a leak, right? I was trying to do a lot of stuff that D&D 5e just doesn't do, so it was kind of my fault, to be completely honest. But yeah, it was definitely a lot of that. Fix something here, realize, that just creates a problem here, and just sort of go back and forth trying to make things work when you're fighting against the game entirely.
My big example of that would be Stars Without Number, where the economy in that game is not very well defined and it is not very well balanced. So when our group started hammering deep into dealing with economic aspects of the game, we eventually basically had to house rule entire goods markets and ways to do valuations of supplies and determine labor markets and how they differ on different worlds, and it just had to grow this huge level of complexity just to support the little basic things we were trying to do. And it just completely fell apart because then you realize that starships are completely not valuated properly in any way.
Yeah, that happened to one of our GMs. He basically wanted to do a Star Wars campaign, and we did run it for a little bit. It ran its course, but using the Traveler system. The thing is that the economy of all the Star Wars systems, things are ridiculously cheap, especially the starships. But in Traveler, they're very expensive. I think there's a factor of 10. So the rewards we were getting for missions and stuff like that would mean that we'd never actually acquire a ship or something like that, unless you use the Traveler rule, basically being in debt to someone else and all the complications that came with it. But the idea of a player just, settling up and having a Millennium Falcon was, unless it took 10 or 20 sessions to resolve that, was, for all intents and purposes, impossible, right? Because the economies just didn't match. That's another reason why people hack systems. They basically want to have a setting, but the rules of that setting as published don't fit, so they try to use other rules, and sometimes, you have that breakdown as well. But one of the things I do like about Star Without Number is the whole sort of GM turn kind of situation. In fact, I would like to graph that into more games because I like the idea of how it manages the factions. But has anybody tried to use a faction in something other than Starts Without Number?
So I had this breakthrough a couple weeks ago where the hack I'm making is very much based in Burning Wheel with bits from like Apocalypse Engine and similar other things. But I was making it so that like you could just make factions as a facsimile for not having to make like little moot characters or like random NPCs as like, oh, this is guard number 23 of this faction's facility. Instead, I was like, well, you can sort of make up a character sheet for the faction, and it'll have a couple different skills and like its own beliefs and things, and then you can just sort of call off of that whenever you need random NPCs. So you could be like, oh, this faction has like skill 3 at whatever fighting. So when you have to deal with the fighting aspect of that faction, those characters are going to have that skill at that level. But what I realized also was that you could just take that directly and map it into a faction turn system, and it worked perfectly fine. So you could just like take the sort of like organization of the faction turn from Stars Without Number and just have factions use all of the existing things I had for them in my game already. So it worked out like surprisingly well without me even realizing I had already done that.
Yeah, I think one thing when you're like trying to take a part of the game wholesale and put it into another game is like, you know, how modular it is. So like, I feel like the faction turn is a good example because it's like its own separate subsystem. It's like very self-contained. Another thing that I like have found success in moving to other games is like a sort of like beliefs, instincts, and then either like basically you do instead of a belief a goal or just beliefs, instincts, and traits, and just tie that into the reward system of whatever game you're playing if you want to, you know, force a little bit more character interaction and make the game a little bit more about the characters. And because, you know, obviously beliefs, instincts, and traits are tied into Auwrath and Burning Wheel, which is fundamentally just a different way of looking at experience points, right? So if you reward that, if you tie that into the same reward system, it kind of works in whatever game you want to play, so long as you want to have the game be driven by the player's beliefs.
Yeah, along those lines, I talk about experience. One of the things I always wanted to do was have a what I call a mission-specific reward system, a success failure, not like saying D&D or many other similar system where, oh, I killed this monster, I got X amount of XP, and everything else is a story award, whatever that may be. Instead, I would like to have a system where, you know, you have your primary mission that gives you a bulk of the experience, whatever that may be, or points, etc., and then have like secondary and bonus objectives, and then finally have like personal objectives. And here's what I would take the clocks from Apocalypse into effect, because I would like to have the idea of each character having their own clock and having their own goals, right? Because, you know, as they do more to further that personal goal in any one session, that clock moves forward until they complete it. In fact, Dave, I think that's how Adam has tackled experience in Mage. Is that correct?
That is, yeah. I was just thinking about that, actually. Yeah, because the reward and experience system from Mage is primarily focused on actually turning up. There's the baseline, you get an experience point if you survive the session, which Adam wasn't particularly happy with, and he decided, like a lot of people do after having played other games, taking stuff like beliefs, instincts, goals, and transplanting them. It's a particularly interesting example because it didn't work super well. We weren't familiar enough, and I don't think Adam was familiar enough with Mage 20 as a system to be able to properly weight either the clocks, which we used, and also further like the XP that was attached to that, So we ended up actually being very, very far behind the curve on where we should be. And around session 6 or 7, I don't remember exactly which it was, we ended up just getting like an injection of XP points that we basically missed out on because the way we'd been playing just hadn't meant that we'd met any of those personal goals. We'd done a lot more world building and just interpersonal character interactions, which just meant we hadn't done anything that was clock moving worthy in the way that it was transplanted as a system and intended to replace the XP.
Which brings a question I think Scaradium brought it much earlier in the program about hacking something to death, hacking it to pieces. It comes to a point where you hack to it, and either you break the game, say the game balance, for example, if that's a focus of what you're trying to hack, or simply, like Sam pointed out, there were so many systems that, mixing together that you have this sort of mess that doesn't work. At what point do you say, okay, screw this, either I'm going to stop hacking and try to work with what I have, or chuck the entire system altogether and say, you know what, I'm going to just try with something else?
It's really, I think, a question that comes down to whether or not the underlying systems of the game are aligned, perhaps is the correct word, with the gameplay style that you want to encourage. Trying to think of some good examples, but if you're hacking something which is relatively small scale, for example, wanting to additively put in a faction system, for example, into D&D, which is something that I know Stephen did some work on initially during the West Marches, and he was trying to basically reskin the Stars Without Number faction turn that we've talked about a little bit before and make it fantasy skinned, and that would hopefully help him foster a living world for his campaign. That still sort of feels like hacking to me because he still wanted to play D&D in the sense that people were supposed to go out, do adventures, kill things, find stuff, and that fit very well with what he wanted his players to do. And this was a hack and an addition which was going to hopefully just enrich that experience. Later it's turned out that he doesn't think that he wants the West Marches to be about going around looting dungeons and killing stuff, and more about exploring. And that is probably the time when you want to throw away the hacks and say, all right, the baseline of the game isn't encouraging this exploratory sort of play, which is what I want now for the groups. There's no rules about traveling, or if there are, they're very light. There aren't particularly good rules for open land travel, generating worlds, weirdness, which is one of Stephen's key things, which is particularly endearing. But I think that's probably, to use an example that most of us have probably seen, when you want to stop hacking and you want to look at finding new mechanics that are going to encourage it. And that's really when you've gutted the game. You're no longer doing anything that's aligned with what the game originally set out to encourage.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. In my own experience, similar type deal with 5e is, I sort of at one point realized that what the game was becoming about was not what I wanted the game to be about, and that was only going to get worse as the characters leveled up and just got better and better at only one thing, which was killing monsters. I think the analogy I've heard used before is, if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And all D&D does as you level up is make that hammer bigger. I agree. It's the point where the the entire game is no longer about what you want it to be about.
And the nails are on fire while you're hammering at them. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to my other analogy of the boat, it's when you can no longer patch holes in the boat and now the boat's on the bottom of the ocean, right?
You've got a giant hammer, but all your nails are actually just feelings and relationships, and how does that work?
Yeah, the Adam Koebel style of GMing any game where it becomes an interpersonal relationship management simulator.
Yep. That's basically what happened with my original Pathfinder game, where it's just like, I have all these combat mechanics and all of these in-depth rules for that, but none of my players ever learn them, and none of them ever want to learn them, and they're all really bad at that, and that's none of what they want to do ever. So how do I make this work?
That's a really good point, actually. We've been talking a lot about, from a GM-centric standpoint, what we want to convey. It's like very often I've found in my experience, perhaps more often, in fact, that the group doesn't play in the way that you expect them to, or the system expects them to. And I feel that just one of the base philosophies for being a GM is to try and encourage people to have fun, and your players to be able to role play in the way that they want to. So being very receptive to people's attitudes towards stuff can be important as well. Like, I've tried to run games which are very dark, gritty, very dark fantasy inspired. And then I've had people playing characters whose names are just like puns, and all they want to do is dance, be a bard. And you have to be mindful of that as well when you're either picking a game or wanting to hack it to fit them, or when there's a disparity between, like I say, yourself as a GM and your expectations, or the system as kind of an arbitrator of whether they're allowed to do that or not. And then we come back to the question of, is it worth hacking this? Is it close enough in alignment that we can allow for people to do what they want while keeping true to the game? Or is this group too terminally silly for Pathfinder, for example?
Yeah.
And then you have to kind of give up the ghost a little bit. And
I like to call that the GM pivot, right? It's like you thought your game was about one thing, and then it met the players and became about something else. So, it's time to just pivot and have it be about what the players want.
Yeah, I've had that problem in the past. I guess because I come from the old-time Dungeons and Dragons type, mechanically driven GM fiat thinking. It's like, oh, it's my game, and you guys are going to play it. And so when my players had pivoted, when the rules, whether as is or as I hacked them, have met the road, that is the players, are like, oh no, now I'm done. You guys don't want to play this, and I've been learning by watching Adam and by talking about this, to learn that you have to be able to pivot, right? Whenever possible. So I think player communication, as we talked this before, is very important, right? In game and out of game. And also, as that happened is, for example, even when you say, oh, I explained something to the players, or vice versa, or GM explains it, and then when I start playing, I thought, wait a minute, I thought this was about this. It can also happen that people hear the same words, but come up with widely different expectations. So, I think Sam is right. I mean, you have to be able as a GM to pivot. Talking about pivoting, it's very interesting going back to the show, in this case, Mage, and also the Moldiver, I think it is. Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah,
Moldvay, yeah.
Moldvay, yeah. Talk about English not being your first language. And that's a French name, so it doesn't help. It occurs to me that Adam's style of play, being character-centric, very much allows for that and encourages it. He knows that people are going to pivot. So it basically says, okay, here you are. Here's the thing. Here's some rules I want to talk about. Now let's see what the players do with it. Is that your experience in front of the camera and when playing with Adam? Dave?
Yeah, I think I very much expected a certain style of play when I signed up, so to speak. Yeah, that's why it was very interesting when we played Moldvay, because it's almost as far as possible from that style of GMing. Your characters are pawns. Like, getting too attached to them is silly because you're going to make them more risk-averse, and they're not going to be as effective in dungeons and stuff. But I was very heavily character-driven as well, and I did end up just having a character I sort of fell in love with and tried to keep alive against all odds. And succeeded, yeah, which is very odd.
Cannot kill the shadow.
No, you cannot. Maybe we will see them again one day. I would quite like that. But to the original point, yeah, there's a certain degree as a GM, whether you decide to pivot or not, right? I think it's totally valid for a GM to say, I'm sorry, I really wanted to play a game this way, and while I'm happy to cater to bits of this, I'm not having fun, I'm getting frustrated by this, in the same way that any player can also say that. It just tends to feel a lot more firm and final in the case of the GM, because they are the most, perhaps, integral part. If you don't have a GM for a campaign, you don't have a campaign. One of the players drops out, you still have a campaign, and it sucks, but you can continue on. So I think it's interesting to think about how much you're willing to pivot as a GM. And I think your point about Adam coming into that expecting it, and me as a player expecting that from him, and being able to rely on the fact that he's going to let us kind of play how we want to and do whatever we want, was very true.
So what I noticed that Adam tends to do with every single game, and isn't necessarily supported by most of the games he plays, and I think this is probably something that he learned mostly from Burning Wheel, is that he tends to start out the game with cooperative world building outwards from all of the characters, which most settings don't work very well for, because most games are very tied to their setting. So when you have a cooperative world building and you're building out from these characters, most games don't support that very well. And so you end up having to hack around that. And that's something I've been noticing that he's been doing with pretty much every single campaign he's been running, where it's just like that becomes the main focus. And that's always what he has to keep fixing and working around with. So that was like the main thing I was trying to emulate and fix the problem of with my hack.
Yeah. There are a lot of times that you can tell you would rather be playing Burning Wheel, like you say. It fits that style of GMing, which is, like you're saying, very, very cooperative in the world building, very player and character centric. So seeing him kind of butt up against the other systems is quite interesting, and I think honestly it's one of the reasons that this particular Roll20 group started up. We're just trying a bunch of systems and seeing how they play, both with Roll20 as a system, and I mean, because contractual obligations and all that, but also because, it lets him see how the interplay between this particular group, which you know is also very character-centric, is interfacing with these particular things. Moldvay was interesting because it was opposite of character-centric. Mage is interesting because it claims to be very character-centric, but we're noticing more and more that that's not really the case. Like you're saying, there's a very established fiction and a way you're supposed to be playing that, despite all of the rules, doesn't come across very well until you have experience with the system.
Yeah, I actually, going off that sort of point, when of sort of the system or the setting and informing the type of game, if you've ever heard of the game Microscope, which is basically a world-generating game, a group of mine for Stars Without Number game, we wanted to use Microscope to generate the sector before. And it worked, but at the beginning of the game Microscope, you have something called yeses and nos, things that you want to ban or force into the game. You know, you go around the table and each player picks one. But the thing about doing that with an already established setting is that there's these sort of inherent yes and nos that if you don't make sure that everyone is clear on, you end up running into problems later in the game.
There was that one guy who said no to spaceships, or
right, like, you know, or the guy who says, you know, yes to warp gates, and it's like, well, that just doesn't work in Stars Without Number for X, Y, and Z reason. And so it's like interesting how, you know, collaborative world building can sort of run into that established setting. But I think it's also worth noting that you can definitely do it around that setting. Like, it did work. It took some finagling during our Microscope game, but it did work, and we did create a great setting and a great sector for Star Without Number play.
Yeah, talk about Star Without Number and some other games. In fact, I noticed a very much a pattern when I looked at sort of quote-unquote generic sci-fi games, especially space games. They almost always have the same trope in the beginnings, like, oh, humanity started on Earth, expanded on the stars, and then something, whatever that may be, happened, and now you're caught off from Earth and all that stuff. Like, but I don't want that thing to happen. I don't want the big scream or the warp coming alive or anything like that. I want to build a system where, yeah, we are playing one corner of the galaxy, but more like Traveler, like Earth's still around, and I want that connection, that historical connection. So one of the things I would say no to is like, well, I don't want this big thing that everything collapse. I get it. You're trying to do it for your, you know, for your system, so you can have different type of technologies and have hidden or, you know, old tech. But I really don't care. I'll say no to that. And someone will say, well, that then it's not Stars Without Number.
Yeah, part of the reason so many settings do that is because if you don't do that necessarily, then you end up in a place where you get like so far into the future of sci-fi and you get like so far into like techno-utopianism that it becomes almost impossible to make like an easily able to be played game because you lose almost all of the touchstones that you're supposed to have. You end up getting societies where like being a biological entity doesn't really mean anything anymore. People can be like disembodied consciousness that exists along multiple bodies, or like they can clone themselves into multiple places at once, or like you get levels of technology that just like completely obliviate any sort of existence of individualism or like discovery and adventure, just because like the way technology advances is you'll reach some sort of point where like all of these things that make an interesting role-playing game sort of fade out in like just the pure degree of like technological advancement you end up getting if you have like a galaxy spanning empire that's been around for 3,000 years since Earth.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. What I was going to say to that was, well, I think that's like very true in this, like, in this example, right? You get far enough in the future, get close enough to utopianism there are not going to be any quests for your people to do because they're just like 4 guys in a system which has already worked out all its problems technologically, and that's totally valid. I think the problem comes, though, like we were talking about sometimes with these generic-y type sci-fi systems. We talked a little bit earlier about Savage Worlds, which kind of claim to be completely like setting agnostic, but do have that. They've kind of put enough of their thumbprint on the gameplay that it encourages play in a certain way, and that's when people have a lot of problems, because you either want something to be really honestly setting agnostic, which is going to just lay out some dice for you and like different methods of solving problems, or you want one that has an established setting and that you can play to, not one that encourages a setting which they've not put in the main rulebook, but they obviously are selling like a bunch of supplements which include. Yeah, and you want one or the other, really, and a lot of people dislike systems where there's that sort of hybrid, which, yeah, I think the examples which were given were pretty good ones of. You can't really play Savage Worlds without the focus on action because the resolution mechanics are set out in a specific way, right? So you're never going to have your like high school band drama in that, because the dice aren't going to fit the way they've been set up with the kinds of conflicts you're going to be generating.
Yeah, well, 2 things. On the world building front, it all depends on what you establish beforehand. And in other words, these games establish that, and there's a good reason for that. You know, if you take the assumption that technology will advance that far, that fast, there's a lot of other settings, like, say, Star Wars, who don't make that assumption. Very advanced technology, but a lot of stuff's just sort of stuck, very basic stuff. I mean, you don't go from light speed to teleportation to other galaxies and stuff like that. So you can put some limits into that. The other aspect is that if a game is too generic, it's basically just a sheet with a series of instructions, like if someone attacks you, roll 3 dice. If you want to talk to someone, roll this dice, and that's it. And so it has no feel and has no weight. But once you start having not only the mechanics, but also the art, the descriptions, the way things are written in a certain way that encourages a certain style of play, then it's like, well, if we hack it too much, then it doesn't work.
Yeah, I don't think we, as a group of people, and the wider community around us are particularly the type who are going to enjoy those completely setting agnostic things. But I understand that there is some sort of market for it somewhere, and I don't know where it is. I was only including it as kind of a nod to this perceived user base that really wants to build everything from the ground up, but also wants to add a generic dice pool system on the side as a conflict resolution that doesn't have anything to do with the setting.
If you could do it well enough, I feel like that would be Adam's ideal system.
Sure, yeah, we've been talking recently, well, he's been talking recently, I've been speaking to him about it, about having very light systems and then having them with the purpose of allowing for house ruling on top of that. So I think that's maybe around the right area for very setting agnostic type stuff, but I also think you want to use the setting as the onus for creating what little rules you have. I don't know. I can't get my head quite around it that people want stuff like GURPS, right? It doesn't engender itself in any way to a play style.
Yeah, I'm with that as well.
This is sort of like what my whole project was, is like, I love the gameplay style of Burning Wheel, but I don't really like being stuck to the setting of Burning Wheel. So I tried to like strip it down to like, well, what makes all of this gameplay, what makes all of these relationships work? And it basically just came down to the fact that like you can strip out most of the setting stuff of these systems where you still have like these interactions, which are all about like characters being based on like their skills and advancing by doing. And it's like, it's all about their relationships with each other and their beliefs and how they like tie those into the world. But you don't have to have anything about fantasy in that. So what I've sort of been going down the approach of, well, let's outline a lot like how people interact and work on like a basic level. Because yeah, a big problem with a lot of these like universal settings are they are either way too detailed with like specific rules for everything, or they're way too light where they don't actually give you any guidance. So I was trying to just sort of like make something that's well-defined in how things interact, but just leave out the actual setting stuff and just explain about how to fill in setting that sort of like fits in all the gaps and flavor of all of that. And so that's sort of what I've been trying to do.
And to be clear, I wasn't attempting to say that process is like invalid. I think, in fact,
it's just really hard to do.
Yeah.
I think what a lot of people define setting for a role-playing game as is really just like the world around and the flavor. But I also think that having character-centric systems like in Burning Wheel, I think Arthur, beliefs, instincts, goals are the setting because they set up the way in which the game is going to be played, in the same way that saying that there is an elven kingdom and a dwarven kingdom and dragons that exist is also going to influence the way in which the game is played. So, yeah, just to clarify that, I think that's still a totally worthwhile thing to do. Like, the human interaction stuff is the crux of a lot of character-centric stuff, allowing for the rules to accurately both portray and also influence the way that people like interact with each other mechanically is something that's really, really cool. And going back to the roots, I think, and removing all the elves and the swords and sorcery stuff from Burning Wheel is actually like a really good starting point for that, because it does Jewel of Wits as one of the best and most in-depth ways of having interpersonal interactions in like a conflicting sense of any game that I've seen. So I think that's really cool.
Well, with that, because essentially I'm going to have to can of worms the subject, because we've gotten into the idea of simple versus complex systems. The idea that sometimes there is no such a rule and GMs have to then, and players have to fill in the rules, versus there's always a rule and everything that comes with it. So probably next time we're going to tackle that subject with our panel. But for now, we're running out to the hour. So if you guys like to tell us where we can find you on the interwebs, Dave?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me. I had a really fun time just talking about nerdy game stuff. That was great. So thank you all for having me. If you'd like to find me and hear more stuff, I am on Twitter at Dave_the_human, which is a complete bald-faced lie, but nonetheless, that's where you'll be able to find me there. And like we've mentioned before, I'm one of the moderators for Adam Koebel's Mathsquad Community, so the best places to join in with that are on twitch.tv/Adam Koebel, or heading to the Discord, which I can't link you to with my voice, but you'll be able to find it, don't worry. There's a command for it in the Twitch chat. And I also do a little bit of personal streaming at twitch.tv/Auwrath, will probably be playing a little bit more when I've handed in some of my university deadlines. Thanks very much, guys.
Sam?
Yeah, I am Sam. I am on Twitch at twitch.tv/wizenedfool. Don't do a lot of streaming yet. Hopefully do a little bit more in the future, but I do show up on people's streams every now and then, and I hang out in chats. Also on the Mathsquad Discord as Wisefool, so feel free to say what's up. Yeah, that's all I got.
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Scaridium, SEARIDIUM, and pretty much Twitter is probably the best place to look. I mostly rant about science things, but from there you can get pretty much everything else I do.
And as always, if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, Lessons Learned, you can find me there. You can find me as Rafa Writer on Twitter and on Tumblr. And Lessons Learned 1 on Twitch. I do not do a lot of streaming, but I'm still always hanging out and willing to talk to everybody on the chat. As a reminder, this is the Mathsquad Community podcast, created by our Lord and Savior, Adam Koebel. Although he's more the patron saint, really, but we keep him in our thoughts always. And you can find him as Skinny Ghost on our Skinny Ghost and Reddit, and of course on Twitter, and Adam Koebel on Twitch and on YouTube. Thank you all for being here, and we will see you when we see you. Good night.